Hello everyone and welcome back to the Ultimate Beginner's Guide to Automotive Photography, Section 2, Terms and Definitions. Now before I get too deep in giving you all the terms and definitions that you'll need to know to get through this course efficiently, first I would like to give each of you a very small task. That task is to make sure that whatever camera you are using is shooting in a RAW file format. You may be asking yourself, what is RAW file format? Don't worry, it's not super complicated. By default, most phones and cameras actually take relatively compressed images in order to save space on their memory cards or hard drives. However, if you would like to venture into the realm of becoming a professional photographer, you will want to shoot at the highest file size possible because the bigger the file size, the more data is stored within that photo. Essentially what this means is a larger file size will give you more flexibility in editing when it comes to brightening, darkening, and adding colors to your photo. The lower the file size, the less flexibility you have. So considering a huge part of automotive photography is the editing side of things, I would like you guys to make sure that you're shooting in a RAW file format. Right here I have my personal camera, my Sony a7 Mark III, and I'm gonna show you how I set up RAW file format in my menus. I simply click the menu button. Now this is something you'll need to watch out for. Right up here at the top it says file format, but I'm actually not in the photo menu, I'm in the video menu. So I'll need to scroll over still until we get to quality/image size. You can see the little picture icon right here for file format. I already have selected at RAW, but in your camera it may look a little bit different, but these are the other options you can see. RAW, RAW plus JPEG, or just JPEG. Again, JPEG is a smaller file size, meaning you won't be able to edit that photo as effectively as if that same photo was shot in a RAW file format. I hope that wasn't too overwhelming for you guys because I have yet another task to assign to you. Now that you are shooting in a RAW file format, it is now equally important that you are shooting in whatever your camera's manual mode is. Unfortunately, cell phones have all kinds of different software, so it'd be impossible for me to pinpoint to each and every one of you how to set that up on your phone. But for those of you that are using a camera, I will use my Sony a7 III as an example. You can see that there is a dial here with a few different menu options. Me switching over to M, for example, will put the camera into manual mode. Okay, what is manual mode and why is it important? Being in manual mode allows you to adjust your camera's exposure triangle on your own. The exposure triangle is just a fancy term for the collection of settings that changes the brightness and darkness of your photo. So, what are the three terms in the exposure triangle? Number one, shutter speed. Shutter speed is the simplest of these three terms. It is literally what it sounds like. It is how fast your camera's shutter opens and closes when it takes a photo. This can have an impact on how bright or how dark your photo is, but it can also have an impact of what things are in focus in your photo. For example, if you take something at a low shutter speed and something in the photo is moving very quickly, you will see motion blur on that object. Whereas if you shoot at a high shutter speed, something moving very quickly will look like it is stuck in time in your photo. The second term is aperture. Now, if you look up aperture in the dictionary, it's not super clear what this setting does. The actual definition is literally an opening, a hole, or a gap. To make things simpler for you, aperture is how much your shutter opens and closes when you are taking a photo. Again, not how fast it opens and closes, that is shutter speed, but how much it opens and closes is aperture. Just like shutter speed, changing your aperture can have an effect on how bright or how dark your photo is. However, what aperture is most known for is having an effect on how much background blur is in your picture. Photos shot at a wide aperture, represented by a low f-stop number, for example f1.8, these photos will have a ton of background blur, versus when you see a landscape photo where every piece of the image is in focus, this is shot at a narrow aperture, which is represented by a higher f-stop number. For example, f10, f14, f16. Once again, using my camera as an example, you can see that the aperture number is right here in the middle towards the bottom of my screen, currently set to f10. but if I move one of the dials here, because I am in manual mode, it is adjusting the aperture for me. So if you felt like you've been wondering your whole life trying to figure out how people get those crazy sharp images with that wicked background blur, aperture is the answer. The third and final setting within the exposure triangle is ISO. The ISO value is essentially changing your camera's sensitivity to light. And again, this is used to change either how bright or how dark your photo is. The way that I personally choose to think about ISO is artificial brightness. The reason I view it that way is because unlike shutter speed and aperture, raising your ISO can actually introduce noise and grain into your image, making it look lower quality. For that reason, when I am taking photos, I always try to keep my ISO as low as possible. I adjust my aperture and my shutter speed settings first, and if I get to the settings that I like there and I still need a little bit more light, then I will add ISO. But in most circumstances, I will try to either change my shutter speed or my aperture to bring in more light instead of raising my ISO. It's also worth mentioning that every camera has a different sensitivity to ISO values. For example, on the camera that I started with, the Canon Rebel T3i, if I took photos at anything above 500 ISO, they were basically unusable. There was so much noise, so much grain, just all these little dots and pixels all over my image. This camera, for example, the Sony a7 Mark III, has a significantly higher tolerance for ISO. I've taken photos north of 20,000 ISO and still been able to save them in Adobe Lightroom/Photoshop when editing. So again, I probably could play with ISO a little bit more on that specific camera, but because of the habits that I developed with my lesser cameras, again, I always choose to adjust my shutter speed and aperture before adjusting my ISO. So that is the exposure triangle. Those three terms, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, is what makes up your exposure triangle. Those are the settings that change the darkness and brightness of your pictures when you're shooting in manual mode. I'm sure you can imagine now how not being in manual mode can sometimes be frustrating. If you're out in the field, you're going to take a photo of a car and you're like, man, I really want a little more background blur. If you're not in manual mode, you might not be able to adjust your aperture. Or if you do adjust your aperture, it might adjust all of your other settings along with it, which then completely changes the brightness and darkness of your image from what you want it to be, and that can be insanely frustrating. So from my point of view, the easiest way to take photos is just to always shoot in manual mode so that you always have the ability to change your settings however you want to. Now that you know what these settings are, it will obviously be extremely helpful to you for you to learn how to change these settings on your specific camera. Most cameras have dials for these sorts of things. So for example, again, on my camera, there is this dial here, which adjusts my shutter speed, this dial here, which adjusts my aperture, and then if you can see on the front, there's a button that says ISO. I click this to the right, and I'm able to change my ISO values. It's also worth mentioning that you can map this entire wheel to be your ISO instead, so that instead of having to click right, you just rotate this wheel clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on if you want to raise or lower your ISO. Most cameras nowadays are pretty customizable as far as these dials and settings are concerned, so watch a tutorial on your specific camera, figure out how to change these settings for yourself, and add some custom options depending on what works best for you. As far as camera settings terms are concerned, there are three other terms that I'd like you to know. The first one is temperature. This is how blue or how yellow your image is. An image that is too blue would be referred to as being too cool. An image that's too yellow would be referred to something as too warm. The next term is tint. This is very similar to temperature, except instead of dealing with blues and yellows, you're now dealing with greens and pinks. And the next term is white balance. White balance is the combination of your temperature, your tint, as well as how bright or how dark your photo is. That actually transitions really well into our next term, which is exposure. Exposure is how bright or how dark your photo is. Does the term exposure triangle make a little bit more sense now? Piggybacking off the term exposure, we can also cover the terms overexposed and underexposed. These are very simple. Overexposed means a photo that is too bright. Underexposed means a photo that is too dark. Now, sometimes how overexposed or how underexposed your photo is can be subjective, but there are objective metrics of measuring the brightness in a photo. So there are such things as proper exposed, underexposed, and overexposed. Okay, the next term we are going to talk about is focal length. The easiest way to remember focal length is essentially to think of it as how much zoom did you use to take that photo. For example, this lens here is called a 24 to 70 millimeters because it can go from a focal length of 24 millimeters all the way to a focal length of 70 millimeters. The bigger that millimeter number is, the more zoomed in that photo is going to be. So if you're somebody who's looking to take wide angle photos, you would want to take photos at something like 14 millimeters, 16 millimeters, or even 24 millimeters. But if you're somebody who likes to get really tight shots of whatever it is that you're taking pictures of, you would want something like a 50 millimeter, a 70 millimeter, or even a 100 millimeter. There are benefits and drawbacks both to shooting at wide angle and to shooting very zoomed in, but we'll cover that in later sections. The next term is depth of field. This refers to how the distance between objects in your image is represented. An easier way to think about this would be how much background blur is in the image. Photos with a lot of background blur are referred to as having a shallow depth of field because only a very small portion of the image is actually in focus. A landscape photo where everything in the image is in focus would be referred to as having a wide depth of field. Next up, we have composition. Think of composition as the overall structure of your photo. And what I mean by that, let's use a car photo as an example. How much of the photo does the car take up in the frame? Is the car off to the left? Is the car off to the right? Is it closer to the top of the frame? Is it closer to the bottom of the frame? Where your subject, background, and foreground are located to one another is your composition. What focal length you choose to use also has an impact on your composition because your background and subject will look different depending on what focal length you shoot at. Take these photos up on screen, for example. This is the same car in the same location, shot at different focal lengths. You can see how much different the car looks in each photo as well as how the background looks in each photo. Wide angle shots will sometimes have rounded off edges towards the corners, whereas zoomed in shots will place much more emphasis on your actual subject. Now let's talk focus. We've got manual focus and autofocus. Autofocus is essentially letting your camera's software determine what in the image needs to be focused on, and it focuses for you. Manual focus is when you adjust your lens's focus manually, usually by twisting a ring on the end of your lens to change what's in focus. This next term is more of a phrase, and that's shooting wide open. Shooting wide open refers to you shooting at your lens's lowest possible aperture rating. This lens here, for example, is a 14mm f2.8 lens. This means that if I'm using this lens and taking photos at an aperture of f2.8, that would mean that I am shooting wide open. People will typically shoot wide open to achieve the most amount of background blur that their lens is capable of producing. All right, let's talk lenses. We've got prime lenses and zoom lenses. I'm again gonna use this 14mm as an example. Now, because this is just a 14mm, this is referred to as a prime lens. You cannot adjust from 14mm. You are locked at that focal length. Prime lenses are really cool because if you want to shoot at lower aperture ratings, prime lenses are usually a bit cheaper than zoom lenses with the same aperture rating. For example, this 14mm f2.8 I think was $500 to $600, whereas this lens on my Sony a7 Mark III is a 24 to 70, also f2.8, but this thing costs almost as much as this camera did. Regardless, that transitions into the definition for zoom zoom lenses, which is a lens that is capable of achieving multiple focal lengths. Next up, we have rolling shot, or rollers for short. A rolling shot is where you, the photographer, are rolling alongside the car that you are taking photos of in order to capture it in motion. This is typically done by either sitting in the trunk of a car, in the bed of a truck, or sometimes dangerously even hanging out of the side of a window to capture a car next to you moving on the road. This is extremely dangerous, so I of course have to recommend against this, even though it is certainly possible that I have done this behavior in the past. A far safer method of capturing cars in motion is something called a panning shot. A panning shot is where you are standing stationary, usually on the side of a track or on the side of a road, and you are rotating your body to follow a car's movement, but you aren't actually moving at anywhere close to the same speed as the car you're photographing. Again, panning shots are usually more typical of what you will see from a track day, and rollers are typically something that you will see done on like a freeway, for example. Next up, we have the term long exposure. Now, this is a bit of a subjective term, but what I choose to define long exposure as is any shutter speed that is slow enough to require you to have to use a tripod. So for me, unfortunately, I have really shaky hands, so I usually try not to shoot at anything below 1/40. So in that case, if I was shooting at 1/30, I would need a tripod. That would be long exposure. However, you can go much past 1/30th of a second for your shutter speed. Most cameras their highest setting goes up to 30 seconds, but there is also a bulb mode, which allows you to just hold down the shutter for as long as you want, and it will just take the picture until you let go of the shutter. These are all examples of long exposure. If you've ever seen those crazy shots of cars that are taken completely at night, but they're completely lit up, and then the sky in the background has all the crazy stars and stuff like that moving, that is long exposure. Now, next up, we have multiple exposures. There's a few different synonyms for this one. Some people call it exposure bracketing. Some people just call it bracketing. Some people call it HDR photography. There's a lot of different words for it. Essentially, what multiple exposures is you taking the same photo multiple times, but at different brightness and darkness values. This is done on purpose because later you can take all of the photos, combine them into one, and now you have detail from 5 individual photos with all different brightnesses combined into one photo. This is an especially useful trick for shooting interiors, as many times you will go to take a picture of the inside of somebody's car and the windshield is so bright that you can't see any detail out of it. When you shoot multiple exposures, one of the darker exposures that you take will have the sky and background through the windshield completely visible, so when you combine those photos in Adobe Lightroom later, you'll be able to have a very nice, clean image as opposed to having the windshield completely bright and overpowering. Light painting, this is a super popular one, so this does require the use of long exposure, the term that I just mentioned, but light painting is the act of essentially putting your camera on a tripod, taking a long exposure, and then walking around the car or your subject in general with some sort of light to brighten it up. You can get really crazy with this if you want. You can even write words with the lights. If you've ever seen photos like that, I'll put one up on the screen right now. Lots of cool things you can do with light painting. All right, 2 terms coming at you. We have portrait photo and landscape photo. This one's really easy. A portrait photo is taken like this. Think the orientation of your cell phone when it's in its natural position. Landscape would be when your camera is in its natural position and the photo goes across like a rectangle. I know this is a bit more video specific, but a lot of times when I'm asking clients whether they want a portrait video or landscape video or even portrait photos or landscape photos, I'll ask them, do you want it portrait like Instagram or do you want it landscape like a movie, TV show? That's the example that I use to get it into my clients' heads, and they'll usually understand that. All right, we've got some camera terms for you. Crop sensor cameras and full frame cameras. A crop sensor is a camera that has a sensor smaller than 35 millimeters. So when you put a lens onto a crop sensor camera, there is a slight zoom to compensate for the smaller sensor. I figured that's the easiest way to explain crop sensors to you, as if you buy a 50 millimeter lens and put it on a crop sensor camera, the photo that you get is not going to be at true 50 millimeters. There's going to be a little bit of a zoom. Versus if you put a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, the photo that camera will produce will be at a true 50 millimeters. So keep that in mind if you're shopping online and you're looking at a gallery of photos shot at 50 millimeter and you really like it, make sure you know whether or not you have a crop or a full frame sensor, because if you buy that 50 millimeter for a crop sensor camera, you may not get the image results that you're actually looking for. It'll be a little more zoomed in. Continuing on with camera terms, we have DSLR cameras versus mirrorless cameras. Now, DSLR literally translates to digital single lens reflex, but that translation tells you absolutely nothing. What a DSLR camera is a camera that when you pick it up, there is a mirror inside that reflects what the lens is seeing into this viewfinder up here. This, however, is not a DSLR camera. This is a mirrorless camera. Now, mirrorless, the term, now seems like it makes more sense when I explain DSLR that way. This camera does not have a mirror that reflects the image from the lens into the viewfinder. Instead, mirrorless cameras will have a digital viewfinder that shows you a projected image of what the lens is seeing through the sensor. All types of cameras have their pros and cons, but if you've purchased this course, the most important thing is just to get your hands on a camera that allows you to change your exposure triangle settings manually so that you can get out there, start taking some photos, and figuring out what you like best as a photographer. So those were the terms and definitions. I know that was a super overwhelming and information-packed section, but I'm really grateful that you guys stuck it out with me. Now, I hope you were able to grab a pen and paper and write everything out as I was saying everything, but if you didn't, no worries. I've got all the terms and definitions collected into a PDF guide that you can read from going forward. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into section 3.